Over the past few years, we've done a lot of videos on budget-friendly home theater equipment for those of you just getting started. Videos on things like receivers, speaker demos, and more. With that said, today we want to make a video that would help to explain some of the things that you may need to know if you're looking to get yourself a new AV receiver. We'll be going over all the basics, power ratings, channel count, HDMI, room correction, and some of our favorite home theater receivers. So if you're looking to get into a home theater and you want to get your first AV receiver, then stick around and we'll get into it right after the intro. Alright, so as I mentioned, in this AV Buyer's Guide, we're going to be looking at some of the important things that you need to know about AV receivers before you put down your hard-earned money on a new AVR. But before that, this video is brought to you by Valencia Home Theater Seating and their new Tuscany Ultimate Luxury Editions. We recently had the opportunity to review these new chairs, and needless to say, we were pretty impressed with them. So if you want to check out the full review, we'll leave a link down in the description below. These chairs are 100% covered in the all-new 20,000 grain matte black Italian Napa leather, which really makes them stand out compared to other home theater chairs on the market. They've also managed to integrate a lot of other new features, like the removable cup holders in this blacked-out chrome finish, 7-color RGB LEDs, and a new control panel with built-in seat memory and home button, so you can get it set up exactly how you want it every single time. Something else with these new chairs is the double-stitch perforated leather over the actual seating surfaces, which not only adds to their looks, but it also makes them incredibly comfortable and long-lasting. And of course, with all of Valencia's products, you're going to be getting the highest quality craftsmanship and extreme attention to detail that you've come to expect from all of their home theater seating. And if you want to build your own, you can take advantage of their helpful online 3D customizer tool to build your very own seats. Valencia also has services like their white glove delivery, an easy online checkout process, and great customer service that you can connect to by phone or email. So go ahead and check out Valencia's website from the link down in the description. And with that said, let's get back into the video. The first thing we're going to talk about here is the power rating of an AV receiver. This number essentially tells you how much power in watts your receiver can supply to your speakers. And of course, the higher the power rating is, the louder your speakers can get. Power rating isn't a really useful number on its own, but if you know how the power rating was measured and some of the specifications of the speaker that you're trying to run, you can get a pretty good idea of how well a receiver might be able to run a certain set of speakers. For example, we get a lot of questions on our channel about how well the Onkyo TX NR6050 that we reviewed in a previous video would actually run a set of speakers like the Klipsch 5.0.2 from Costco. Well, if we know that the receiver has a rating of 90 watts per channel at 8 ohms, and the tower speakers are 8 ohms and rated to handle up to 100 watts of power continuously, that would imply that the TX NR6050 and the Klipsch speakers would be a good match. Speaker sensitivity, which is how loud the speaker can get at a certain input voltage and distance, also has a part to play in all this. Typically, you'll see a number like this, which basically says that the speaker will output 96 decibels of sound with a 2.83 volt signal from 1 meter away. The most important part about this is it's a standardized way of figuring out sensitivity, so pretty much all speakers have this number, meaning you can compare and contrast different models to pick the perfect one for your space. We wouldn't recommend getting speakers with anything lower than 84 dB or so, as that's the point where you really need a powerful amp to get a lot of output from your speakers. On the other hand, anything near 100 dB says that the speaker is very sensitive and shouldn't have any problem running with just about any AVR out there. With that said, it's almost as important to understand how power ratings are defined, so you know how much power a receiver actually has. Again, we'll use the Onkyo 6050 as an example. If you go to the product page, it says that the receiver is actually able to give you 200 watts of power output, which sounds really good at first until you realize that actually that's under completely impossible circumstances. While the receiver probably gave the engineers at Onkyo 200 watts of output in their test, this was at a 6 ohm load at a frequency of 1 kilohertz with 10% distortion. And that was with only one channel driven. Normally, if you're using a receiver, my guess is that you're probably going to be listening to more than one speaker at a time. But the next power rating, which is 90 watts per channel into an 8 ohm load from 20 Hz to 20 kHz with 0.08% distortion, is much more reasonable and actually represents what the receiver can do if you want to use it for listening to music or movies. You may have also noticed that this says FTC at the end. And this is also important because the FTC recently changed their guidelines on defining to consumers how amplifier power is supposed to be reported when they're trying to sell you a receiver. This way, every receiver that uses the FTC standard test is actually going to be testing their receiver the same way, so it's easier to compare one receiver to another based on the wattage rating that's being shown. With all of that said, pretty much any receiver that can achieve around 75 watts per channel is probably going to do just fine powering any set of speakers out there. Another number that you'll run into when shopping for different AV receivers is the channel count, which looks something like this. Basically, it tells you how many different speakers you can connect to the terminals on the back, with the first number showing you the amount of base level speakers, like 5 or 7 channels, followed by the number of subwoofers, like .1 or .2, and finally the number of Atmos channels, like .2 or .4. So a 7.2.4 has 7 surround speakers, 2 subwoofers, and 4 Atmos speakers. Now, we really can't say that there's a correct number of channels because, of course, it all depends on how many speakers you want to get, which depends on your room and your budget. With that said, it's never a bad idea to get a few more channels than you think you might need, which will be a huge help when you decide to upgrade at some point in the future. For example, most of the receivers that we reviewed have at least 7.2 channel output with Dolby Atmos support. That way, if you want to get a 5.1 surround system, you can add an extra subwoofer or 2 surround channels or Atmos channels if you want to expand your system. One thing that's also important to consider when looking at channel count is the amount of pre-outs, if any, the receiver has. Adding an external amplifier is one of the best ways to upgrade an AV receiver, but you're going to need the right connectors to get the amp hooked up correctly. And that's why you need pre-outs. These bypass the amplifier inside the receiver, giving you a clean analog signal for your external amplifiers. These are usually RCA connectors, unless you get a high-end receiver which may come with XLRs. And depending on the receiver you get, you might have a full set of these, or you might only have pre-outs for your front, left, and right channels. More affordable models will usually be limited to the amps built into the receiver. So if you want that extra upgrade path, make sure you look for pre-outs with whatever receiver you might be interested in. HDMI is another topic that can be pretty confusing when you're looking for an AV receiver because there are so many different versions and numbers, but once you break it down, it's actually not all that bad. The first thing we'll dive into is the HDMI version, and for most newer receivers, this will usually be HDMI 2.0 or HDMI 2.1. The difference between these is that the HDMI 2.0 only supports up to 4K connections at 60 Hz, while HDMI 2.1 supports 4K at 120 Hz. But the confusion doesn't end there. If the box says HDMI 2.1, in theory, the receiver should support 4K 120 Hz and all of the other features that come with HDMI 2.1. Well, recently, the HDMI Licensing Authority, which is a group that allows manufacturers to use HDMI on their products, have made some big changes. Now, any product with HDMI 2.0 capability is considered to be an HDMI 2.1 capable device, even if it doesn't actually have any new features. It doesn't make any sense, and it's really just a big headache if you're trying to shop for a new receiver. Thankfully, one thing you can still look at is the link speed of the HDMI connection. If your receiver says HDMI 2.1 at 18 gigabits, then it's not going to support any new HDMI features. But if you find one that runs at a higher rate, like 32 or 40 gigabits for example, those devices will support higher resolutions and frame rate of the newer HDMI 2.1 standard. And of course, this is really important if you want to use any type of next-gen console with your new receiver without resorting to using something like eARC to send an audio signal to your system. One last thing that we should also mention here is that HDMI and HDCP, which is another specification that a lot of receivers list, aren't actually the same thing. HDMI tells you the resolution, frame rate, and other features that the device supports, while HDCP tells you what kind of copyright video you can play through that device. Whenever you're watching something like a movie from a 4K Blu-ray player or a streaming device, that signal is protected by HDCP. The reason there are so many different versions of HDCP, like 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, and even 2.3, is because, well, people keep breaking it. In the end, it's probably not even something you need to worry about. Most HDMI devices will work just fine if you hook them up and you're using good quality cables. But it's still something to consider just in case you end up having problems with handshake issues in the future. Pretty much every receiver manufacturer these days offers some kind of room correction software with their models. For instance, you've got Yamaha with YPOW, Onkyo with AccuEQ, Denon and Marantz with Odyssey, and higher-end ones like Anthem and Arc, or Dirac with Emotiva and other brands. These softwares are designed to automatically configure your speaker levels, distances, and EQs using tones from your speakers and your setup microphone. In theory, these act as a simple way to automatically calibrate your system, but they aren't always perfect. And we've had lots of cases where the calibration doesn't sound as good as the settings we've set up manually. This may just be a problem with the room that we're in, but because of this, we don't usually review the automatic room correction built into most lower-end receivers. We would always recommend setting your receiver up manually, then running room correction to see if there's any difference. We also suggest using the best mic possible. Something like the U-mic or the Omni mic are great choices, and they should help you achieve the best results possible. When you're shopping for a home theater receiver, you should also be thinking about other features that you might find useful. Lots of receivers are coming with AM/FM radios, phono preamps for using turntables, composite and other standards that you might want to use for stereo music listening. On the other hand, as we mentioned earlier, some higher-end receivers will also give you things like XLR connections for your pre-outs, as well as coax and Toslink inputs, so you can connect pretty much any type of amplifier, music streamer, or other system right into your receiver. If you don't want to add a whole bunch of other stuff to your system though, also be on the lookout for receivers with built-in streaming and USB storage playback. Using these, you can pair your receiver straight to your account and stream things like Tidal, Spotify, and everything else. And that's pretty much it for some of the most important things that we think you should be looking for when you're purchasing an AV receiver. In terms of models that we would personally recommend, we've had really good experiences with receivers like the Onkyo TX NR6050 and the Denon AVR S760H, which are both available at Costco. You get a lot for the price with these receivers. Actual HDMI 2.1 support for up to 5.2.2 Dolby Atmos setups, and a pretty good amount of power. It's also worth noting that these aren't always available though, so make sure you check out Costco's website first to see if they're in stock. And that's pretty much it. So we want to give you guys a big thanks for watching. Please let us know if you have any questions or comments about buying your own AV receiver, and we'll do our best to help you out. If you thought this video was helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. And as always, have an awesome day.